We wish to acknowledge that we are visitors on the ceded territory of the Wolastoqey people, and in particular the city of St. John, which is part of this territory. We honor the Wolastoq people and their ancestors and thank them for sharing their home with us. Oh, now for part two. Elaine will join me shortly. Just a few quick comments. Thank you very much for being here. The Human Development Council is pleased to join 3 other groups in the country. The Inland Refugee Society of BC, based in Vancouver, the Regina Immigrant Women's Centre in Regina, and across boundaries, an ethno-racial mental health clinic based in Toronto. These 4 communities, under the direction of the Institute of Research and Development on Inclusion and Society, will be undertaking a 3-year study of violence against women through the particular lens of 3 distinct populations: Indigenous women, women with intellectual disability and psychiatric disorders, and Sue, what's the other one? Migrant and refugee women. Thank you very much. I'd like to set the scene with a few statistics. I did give you a handout there, and some of it is, 3 pages in there is from the latest Stats Canada 2014 publication. In 2014, there were more than 88,000 victims of police-related and reported intimate partner violence. That's merely the tip of the iceberg. That's police-reported intimate partner violence, almost 90,000 cases in the country. If you burrow deeper into that and look at New Brunswick, you see that the rate for 100,000 in New Brunswick is the 4th highest in the country. And even more telling, and I think a warning sign for us, is that when you look at the 33 census metropolitan areas in the country, St. John ranks 4th of 33 in the rate of intimate partner violence as police reported. So we're delighted to be part of this project, to work with the Domestic Violence Action Group, and to bring to attention to you folks and to others in this community that we have an issue here that deserves our attention.
Thank you. My name is Julie and I work at Second Stage Safe Haven Housing, which is one of the organizations that is involved with the Domestic Violence Community Action Group. And on behalf of the Domestic Violence Community Action Group, I want to say that we're very delighted in being able to partner and to assist the Human Development Council in this research initiative. So just to tell you a little bit about our organization, the Domestic Violence Community Action Group is one of 14 regional networks in the province of New Brunswick that utilizes a community-based approach to assist and meet the needs of victims of domestic violence. The Domestic Violence Community Action Group consists of representatives from government organizations, including social development, public health, the Department of Education, Victim Services, and the St. John Police Force, as well as community-based organizations, including Hestia House, the Domestic Violence Outreach, KV Outreach, as well as Second Stage Safe Haven Housing. And all of the representatives work together in a collective and coordinated response in order to address the issue of domestic violence in our community, as well as developing prevention initiatives.
So there's a few partners in this. It starts off with Iris, who has contracted the Human Development Council to take on this project. So the Human Development Council is represented there. I've been hired on to take the lead in coordinating the project, and I'm really fortunate to have the Domestic Violence Community Action Group as my steering group, so I can turn to them for help, support, helping find resource people, and we'll be working together over the next few years on this project. You'll hear more about that. Just one item that I wanted, or a couple of items that I want to mention. One is that sometimes when we talk about these topics, it can trigger emotions in people, and for some of you, I know that some of you have experienced violence in your life, and if something this evening triggers that in you and you're feeling anxious, we have a support person. Kim, could you stand up? Kim's in the back row. And Kim is with Gentle Path Counseling, and she has offered her services here this evening. So if you feel like I'm getting anxious or I need someone to talk to, Kim's our gal. Okay, and thank you again, Kim. We really appreciate you being here this evening. So what's going to happen over the next couple of hours? We have 4 fabulous speakers. Okay, and we'll have each speaker come up one at a time. I will introduce each speaker. They will do a 10-minute or so presentation. So we'll hear 4 presentations. At the end of the 4 presentations, we'll open it up to questions, answers, comments for anyone in the group. Great. Wonderful. Welcome, gentlemen. So we'll have a question and answer period, and then I'll take about 10 minutes at the end of that just to talk a little bit more about this project, because this is just the beginning. Okay? The project is multi-year, and I want to talk to you about the direction that we're going with the project, and let you know about ways that you can stay in contact, find out more, and then we will close the evening with another little special cultural event. So, with no further ado, I would like to introduce Patty Musgrave. You've heard her sing. Patty is first and foremost a mother, grandmother, advocate for women and youth, and Mother Earth. She follows a traditional Native spiritual path. Currently, she's employed with the New Brunswick Community College in Moncton as the Aboriginal Student Advisor, and she's working on a project. Now, this is a big one. She's working on a project to decolonize the curriculum with the Learning Design Consultant team at NBCC. That's big. Patty is a Nova Scotia girl. She's from Sydney, Nova Scotia, and has spent many years as the Aboriginal Awareness Chairperson for Atlantic Canada for RBC Financial Group. This work was prior to arriving at NBCC Moncton, where she implemented the Sisters in Spirit Vigil, honoring missing and murdered women, and she's been doing that since 2012.
I'm really happy to be here, and you're all really lucky to have Sue coordinating this mission. She's a fabulous person, and I'm very honored to be here to share some information with you. I'm very humbled to be here and honored to carry a message and some thoughts and information on one of Canada's most serious issues, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and that's a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I am personally a rape survivor, so when it comes to violence against women, I'm no stranger to that. I include girls in my topic because each and every week we're watching on social media pictures appearing on our computer screens of little girls aged 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, right across the country. You'll see their missing posters and calls for help to share among our networks, among First Nation communities, to locate our precious daughters, sisters, mothers, aunties, friends. Aboriginal women and girls in this country have been endangered since contact. So if you think that it's something that's just recent, it's not. It's happened since contact. Thank you for caring enough to listen. One at a time, we can change this. Some of my information may be a little bit hard to hear. If that's the case, I'm happy to talk to you about it after. Before contact, organized societies with structure existed. Cultural practices and languages right across the country existed in First Nation communities. They weren't First Nation communities then. They lived on the land. They lived as families and friends, and connection to the land and respect for its resources and animals were intrinsic to Indigenous people. Fish, oceans, creeks, plants, mountains, plains, and animals were valued and appreciated to provide life, and the obtaining and acknowledgement of the above was part of spiritual practice, honoring life. As women, we are considered sacred because we are givers of life. Every woman in this room, regardless of what your cultural background is considered sacred because Creator gave the gift to give life to you as a woman. Oral history was extremely important. Indigenous women and men lived in equality with individual roles that respected their personal diversity. So equality was not something that was new. Equality was prior to contact. Okay, this part, don't get offended. Where European women were fragile and weak arriving here, Indigenous women were viewed as hardworking and strong. European women were confined to affairs of the household. Indigenous women were economically independent, actively involved in decision-making, and Indigenous women controlled their own autonomy. They had the right to divorce, they controlled their own sexuality, they owned what they worked for. And as Indigenous men were drawn into European circles, they became introduced to practices and values that were convinced would bring them greater success, because they were convinced by the settlers that this was the way to go. Historic evidence demonstrates that when women were faced with losing their personal autonomy, they resisted. The loss of autonomy would threaten the socio-cultural cohesion of their communities. So what else would they do but resist? Resistance to genocide and colonization was primarily formed by women since the first moment of conflict with the Indians and settlers. This is very well known amongst Indigenous people. East Coast, West Coast, does it really matter? In 1749, Governor Cornwallis, a familiar name as he still has schools, statues, streets, towns, and cities named after him, authorized the scalping bounties on Mi'kmaq women, children, and men right here on the East Coast. 10 guinea, which would be approximately $25 today, was paid for each scalp. Why? To decimate the Indian population, period. And if you start with the women, you're not going to have any more Indians, are you? Eliminate the women and eliminate the problem. I just want to share this quote with you. It's actually a Cheyenne proverb. You've probably seen it before. During the shale gas protests, it was quite a proverb that circulated around the internet a lot. A nation is not conquered until the hearts of its women are on the ground. Then it is done, no matter how brave its warriors, nor how strong their weapons. So just think on that. The Indian Act is a set of laws first passed by the federal parliament in 1876. The Indian Act joined together early colonial laws and federal laws relating to Indians. The most recent amendment to the Indian Act was as recent as 1985. The Indian Act was never translated into any Indigenous language. That's just an FYI. Its mission, land, membership, local government, and made the federal government the guardians over all First Nations people in Canada. So I won't go back to the first page where it says that we had structure and autonomy. The Indian Act still regulates the daily lives of status Indians, including who is considered an Indian. The Indian Act has organized the Indian identity, individual identity, and the identity of the community. The uninhibited goal of the Indian Act was to assimilate First Nations people into mainstream society. Let's get to violence in Indigenous women. Forced sterilization of Indigenous women as recent as the 60s and 70s. And rather than get into that with little ones present, if you Google it, you'll certainly see lots on that. The systematic approach attacks against indigenous family structure and even more support then and now, maintained by the Indian Act, Indigenous people continue to live with poverty, housing shortage, poor water, etc. Women and children are often without status, regardless of Bill C-31's reinstatement of status for women. Scalping laws are still on the books in Nova Scotia. Foster care, death while incarcerated, and an overpopulation of incarceration among First Nations people, including women, is pretty normal in this country still. RCMP have released a report indicating that there is 1,181 women missing and or murdered in this country. The truth is, there are far more than that. And we need to include the numbers of women since contact who have been murdered, sold, forced to marry white men, who have died in residential schools, and killed by smallpox blankets. That is the real number. The truth is, women are dying in the streets from addiction, poverty, sex trade realities, foster care, lack of adequate housing, employment, mental health treatment, and from a justice system that does not meet their needs or honor them as human beings. The truth is, women are being murdered each and every single day in this country. The truth is that people like Judge David Ramsey of British Columbia pled guilty to sexually assaulting minor Indigenous women and died in prison. The truth is that there are law enforcement officers who have been charged with assault and rape of First Nations women. The truth is really uncomfortable. The truth is that there are still barriers when it comes to Indigenous women obtaining support. Indigenous women in their communities who experience violence are somewhat trapped and often lack the resources to leave and or take their children to a shelter. Leaving the home community is another form of trauma. What then is the alternative? The family is everything to Indigenous people. Why should she be forced to leave because she's been violated? If she lives off reserve, she often feels that no one will believe her because she is Native. Systemic racism is very much alive in our country and in Atlantic Canada. If she lives off reserve, she's likely already marginalized to a point that she may never report it. So what comes next? Carolyn Bennett and her team are in the early stages of national inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Finally, the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, calls to action can be found quite simply by Googling Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. Number 40 in those calls to action call on government to collaborate with Indigenous people to create adequate and accessible Aboriginal-specific victim programs and services with appropriate evaluation mechanisms. Number 41 calls on the federal government to appoint a public inquiry or national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and share the uncomfortable truths. And one of my favorite women of all times is Pam Palmater, who loves to share the uncomfortable truth. and she's got some amazing words to share. You can YouTube her, and she's got a lot of good messages. It's uncomfortable, but they're good. So what can you do? Do you want to know? Yes. Be an ally. Continue to be an ally. Write to your MLA, your MP, RCMP Commissioner Bob Paulson, and hold their feet to the fire, every single one of them. Hold their feet to the fire to honor the commitments and recommendations laid out by the TRC. You know, right now when everybody's talking about, oh, we're going to honor the TRC, oh, we're going to implement the calls to action, oh, we're going to decolonize, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Hold their feet to the fire. Talk about it at your Rotary, your church group, your place of employment. Talk about it. Talk about it. Research it. And if you don't know what to research, email me and I'll be happy to send you information. And then talk about it some more. Talk about it. Demand that Indigenous women be respected. Watch the video Highway of Tears. You can certainly get it on Apple iTunes has it. You can order it from Matthew Smiley, who is the director. He'll be happy to send it to you. And in fact, if you agree to, for $300, you can purchase the Highway of Tears video and use it as a fundraiser. He'll be happy to allow that. If you like, you can do that. Maybe the council would want to do that and host an evening and make a bursary out of it. Do something, raise awareness. And if you really, 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 really want one, just ask, I'll make you a copy. In the meantime, continue these discussions, continue to care, and continue to be an ally. Continue to invite Indigenous women to come and speak and share the discomfort. Continue to understand that risk factors for Indigenous women are greater than non-Indigenous women. The risk of death, however, is far, far greater than even that. And I thank you for being here, and I thank you, Sue, for asking me to come. And if you want more information, Sue has my contact information, which we know. Thank you.
A bit more about Rama. Mrs. Rama Koresh is an internationally recognized expert in global mobility management for migrant groups and individuals. And she is also known as a speaker on cross-cultural communications and cultural diversity. For the last 23 years, she delivered cross-cultural and diversity training and managed global mobility of group and individual migrants internationally and nationally from various backgrounds. Before she moved to St. John in 2010, she lived and worked in Asia, Africa, Europe, Australia, and America. Rama speaks out for human rights of each migrant and ensures that his or her needs are being voiced. She does advocacy for more humane inclusion and tolerance. She demonstrates that with expertise in cross-cultural, why am I having difficulty with that? Cross-cultural communication, global mobility, and advocating for the vulnerable, our communities can come together and provide a critical voice for these voiceless groups by uncovering their stories and fighting for their best interests. Finally, Rama is a member of various boards and committees locally, provincially, and nationally. Last month, she was nominated on the Provincial Council of Descendants of African Immigrants. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Rana. Come on up. Would you prefer to stand or? Okay, so
إلى الجالية السورية أهلا وسهلا فيكم وشكرا على الحضور. Okay, so when Susan asked me to do this presentation, she asked me to talk about violence among refugees. But I was a bit surprised because I said the violence for migrant is actually we have different status within migrants. And to talk about the violence within the migrant community, I would like to take you through some slides just to show you, because actually the violence, sometimes it already happened before they arrived here. So it's part of their life, of their culture, it's something normal for them. Sometimes it actually starts when they are here. And that's depending on under which status they find themselves. So we have I'm going to pass that slide straight to, so we have the immigration that brings people here. We have two umbrellas, two main umbrellas. We have what we call the permanent resident, and then we have the temporary worker. So I'm going to focus more on the permanent resident because they are the one who eventually are the future of Canada. They are citizens. We call them permanent resident, but as soon as they land in Canada, they are the same as a Canadian citizen. The only difference is they're not holding a Canadian passport. It takes them 3 years before they get it, or 4 years. The temporary workers, they are mainly here temporary. Some of them, they decide they like the country, they decide to stay. So under the permanent resident, we have two programs. We have people that come under the provincial and federal program, or some that come with the UN. So if we focus on the refugees, they mainly come with the UN program. If we focus on the province and the federal program, what we call PNP, there are province nominee programs. So under that umbrella, we have the people who come with the employer support, or with the family support, or they come here to open a business, or also people who come here with the family support. For the refugees, most of the people, when they hear refugee, we think they are coming from war zone. We have all kinds of refugees. We have war zone that we have like 70% that we receive in Canada. Then we have diplomat or political refugees. I can give, for example, probably the one that you all know in this room, Losange, who is in the consulate in UK, in the Ecuador consulate. We have military, we have who decide to stop working, and mainly they come from our neighbor to settle in Canada because they don't have the right to leave their military service, and they ask for refugee status. We have also the asylum seekers, and we have prisoner. Why I put prisoner there? Because sometimes people, when they come to Canada, the only way to get their refugee status, or a refugee is a permanent resident eventually when they get the status, because they have the choice either to be deported or to be in a prison. So some of them, they vote for being in a prison, and they have prisons on borders. And then for the temporary one, it's all international student, diplomat, and then you have a list of other ones. So we can go to the next slide. Is very important to understand why the immigrants, this slide shows the steps that every single immigrant passed through, regardless under which status they arrive here. So this is the curve of what we call cultural shock. So when people, they arrive, before they leave their home, and from here I will exclude the refugee, the other immigrants, before they plan, they study about Canada, about the destination and everything before they arrive. So it's what we call a honeymoon. So this honeymoon is about 6 months, it's all the years before they arrive, because sometimes it takes between 6 months to 7 years before they get their papers to be able to come to Canada. For the refugee, why I exclude them? Because they know the destination sometimes only 24 hours before they are on the plane, and then they say, you're going to a city which is called St. John. So they have no clue. They didn't choose to be here. So, while the other one, actually, they chose to be here. And then, as you see, after the 6 months, after their arrival, everything is new, everything is great, they want to learn it, they're happy. but then they have the depression, and that's where violence starts for women, for children, for little girls. So, and then some of them, of course, they pick up this process which is, it can take between 5 years to 10 years for an immigrant to come from home, to come abroad, to call the host country home. So it's a process of 10 years. Next slide is going to show us the type of violence actually the women that go through. It's the same as all Canadian, or because violence doesn't have border. It doesn't have citizenship, it doesn't have a culture or a religion. Every violence is worldwide. However, for the migrant, why is it so unique? Because we have some differences. I talked to people who went through violence, and I worked with them, and they have many reasons. So for physical violence, most of the time, why I put partner and employers. Partner because of the culture sometimes, the background, also for the lack of education, and this violence, when we talk about physical violence, it's also towards little girls because of the gender. Because in some culture, it is the man and the girl, they are not at the same level. So, and that's not only part of some specific countries, but it's in various ones. When I talk about employers, for example, I had a caregiver that was brought here in Canada, in St. John, and she lived through physical violence, not only from the employer himself or herself, but also from the children of the employer. But unfortunately, she couldn't speak up. She couldn't report. A lot of these cases are not reported for many reasons that I'm going to talk about in the next slide. Because of fear of deportation, or because they want to stay here to have their paper done. Then we have economic violence, which is again from partner, employer, community, and service providers. So economic, we have a language barrier. Most of the immigrants, when they arrive, they have a journey when they don't speak French or English. And here in St. John, when they don't speak English, they have a journey of between 1 to 3 years to learn the language, to be able to land their first job. And it depends which culture, what's your color skin, if you're a black African, so it depends on that. Then we have discrimination that they suffer from, because when they offer for a job or when they ask for services, because of the language barrier, sometimes our communities, they are not patient enough. Sometimes they try to find the words they want to say, that to put the message in the immigrant's mouth. Like, for example, I had one of the ladies, she was pregnant, she went to the doctor, she said, I'm not feeling well. And then she was looking for the word stomach, but then the doctor, he said, he said chest, and then he did like that, and she said, yeah. But that's not what she wanted to say. That's not structures to help women and children. They are the first victim in all of the suffering that the immigrants they go through when they arrive here. Then when all of this, what caused it to push them to create ghettos? The provider, the service provider, when people they arrive, they put them in group in one location. And this has happened not only because most of you probably knows only about the Syrian crisis, because they are all together and big numbers, but also when the university they had Saudi students, about 500 students. Everybody lives next to each other, so no practice with the language, no access to learning about the Canadian culture, which is the host country that they have to integrate in, so they have to learn about it. But if they carry on speaking Arabic, eating their own the food like back home. You go to these ghettos, it's like I sent you back in time. That's you traveled back to another country, that you're not in Canada. And this is not happening only in Saint John. We see it also in Moncton with the African students, with the African communities. So this is something we have, that also is a cause of the violence within the family. Then we have the sexual violence, and this is, it's a huge topic, but I'm not going to go through all the details. All of you heard about human trafficking. So migrants from East of Europe and Asia, most of the, like 80% of human trafficking in Canada are women and children. This is last research in 2016. This is the last number that came out, 80%. So that can tell us a lot. Also sexual, for why we have this kind of violence against women, because they also, migrant, they consider as a source of income. When the migrant woman, she can't land a job, and the guy, he can't land a job. However, the government, if they have another child, they will pay children benefit. So the woman has to get pregnant. She wants, she doesn't want. And in some culture, the abortion is impossible, or it's not even a subject to bring on the table. Then adding to that, we have also we have employer, we have like when migrant go for maternity leave or the payment. Migrant, they don't know about all their rights. Most of them, they are aware of the system only 5 years later after they are here. And that's, I'm going to explain why in the next slide. And then psychological violence, which is, and this, why I put Canadian and New Brunswick law. Because if we go to the next slide, we will see, the next one, yeah, we will see there is a law that states that actually a woman or children, and especially a woman, a sponsor, what we call a sponsor, when they arrive to, according to the government of Canada, if you have been granted conditional permanent residence, you must live together with your sponsor in a legitimate relationship for 2 years from the day you receive conditional permanent residency. So this is the law. However, what migrants don't know, it's yes, it is the law, but the law doesn't say you should live in an abuse relationship. There is another department that actually can protect you, and that's why in this slide we find a lot of messages from people who lived through violence. So one of them was service providers don't always connect that well with each other. As a result, there is a huge disconnect at all levels. So migrants, they are afraid to lose their children. To find out about children, they have to go to another department. They want to know about their right as against violence, they have to go to another department. So how a person who literally just arrived or even lived here for so long but focused actually on their just landing, breath and learning the language can navigate themselves through such a complicated system. We need an umbrella. We need an umbrella with all the services and the services that actually can answer to all the vulnerable communities, not only migrants. So, and the last violence, which is emotional, if we can go just back to the other slide. Emotional, it's because The immigrants, they have no voice. Most of the time when they arrive for the first 2 years, they have no access to Canadians on a social level. They do have access to Canadian, but only to people who help with settlement, teach them the language. But I mean here, people they trust, like a friend. Because we have to remember, when a migrant leave their country, they lose their network, their familiar, their comfort zone, their best friends. They tell all secrets. So they have to build that all here. So, and then they end up in ghettos. Then they feel like, because of all the discrimination, because they can't land up a job, because they have language barrier, because they are sponsored, because they feel they are dependent on the other person, and because of the culture, because they don't voice out their discrimination, their violence. So they end up in ghettos, and then we have, what do we have? We have a second-class citizen. We don't want that. Europe had that for a generation, and today they have problems. We want to integrate these people, and to integrate them properly, so not in 10 years, because the groups that arrived today, since November to now, we have 50%, they are children, girls. So in 10 years, it is the next generation of Canada. So we have to do something. We have to stand for them, give them a voice, and help integrate them properly. So, and then we can go straight to here. This just to give you the problem that we have to integrate them. We have what we have the institutional, we have the economic, social, and media. Migrant, they find themselves in the media. So what we actually now have in New Brunswick or in St. John, we have the institutional part, but the other 3 parts, they're not working for us as migrants. The institutional is all the settlement services, all the basic needs, like the transport, taking languages, finding a house, getting the cards, enrolling kids in school. That's what we have right now. Other than economic is, we need, if we go to the next slide, for the economic, we still have to work on how to integrate them, because they have no Canadian experience, or they have their credential is not, they are not recognized. Most of them don't focus on going back to education or taking a new degree. They have a family. Most of the families have between 5 and 6 children. They need bread on the table. They don't want to go back to school. So if they land a job, they land low job, and they don't stay in the job for so long. And then we have the social parts, is we have the school for the children, for the girls. Right now, the school, they don't have the right tools to integrate the children, the migrant children. Because why? Because we are in a rural area. Immigration is something new. However, we were hit by a huge number suddenly of migrants, and we need to do something about it. The other reason why it's going to become a bigger struggle, because till 1970, the migrants who arrived to Canada were from Ireland, UK, Germany, Europe, which means people, migrant with closer culture to what we have here. Since 1971, we have migrant, the source of immigration to Canada is Middle East, Africa, Asia, not Europe. Even people that come from Europe, they are not all, they lived in Europe. Most of the European cities are cosmopolitan. they are flooded themselves by migrants. So sometimes we have migrants who live there for so long and then they move and they come here. So because of all this problem, the women, they feel they are alone. So what happened? When the man can't land a job, we found the woman left alone in Canada to look after children and the house while they go back, if they have the option to go back, because some immigrants, they can't go back, like if we talk about refugees. But most of the Asian, they leave their wives here, they leave the wives and the children, and it's a lot of stress. Then we have the other problem for, like, if we talk about economic, to learn a language barrier. To attend the language courses, you have to be able to do it, which means you have not to have children under 2 years old, because the system pay for your children only to daycare, only if they are 2 years and up. So if you have a baby or a newborn baby, or your spouse think that you are a source of income because you have to be pregnant every year, it will take you 10 years to learn English, which means you're out of job for 10 years, which means it will be very difficult to land a job when your kids, they grow up. And then you have health problem and all. The media right now is giving a very negative message about immigrants. The only stories we hear, they are not, and also the voice, they're not giving a voice to immigrants. Most of the time, it's a San Johnner who represent immigrants who speak to the media in the name of migrant. Or sometimes we have, so they feel isolated. Maybe the media should use the power they have for awareness, how to integrate these people. So for some constructive criticism. And then we have, so you can go to the next slide. I suggested here some, how you can help them. If you want to help, probably you ask, how can we help them? You know. So, however, to integrate the next generation, which are migrant or coming from migrant for immigration, we have to work together. Immigrants cannot be integrated just by the settlement agencies on its own, because right now they do just the basic. They offer the basic, which is the housing, the language, and then usually after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years maximum, when the immigrant, they decide to apply for their citizenship, they lose all those benefits. When they become citizen, they're not allowed to take free language classes. So, yeah, I'm too passionate about this subject, but please feel free to ask questions in French or English. I'll be happy to answer to you. Thank you very much, all.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Debbie Waycott, and I had the pleasure of meeting Debbie just within the last week. She invited me to her home, she introduced me to her husband, and she was very open in telling me her story, her experience of violence. And I just think that she's a wonderful woman for coming here tonight and being willing to share her story with you. But let me tell you a little bit more about her. She lives in St. John. She's a mom. She loves spending time with her daughter, Ashley. She is so happily married that she grins from here to here, and her husband grins just as much. They're really wonderful in inviting me in. Debbie loves movies, mysteries, walking, and soaring, and music. She also loves to volunteer. And the group that she volunteers most with is the Community Association for Community Living, and she helps out with things like barbecues, their luncheons. When we were talking earlier this week, I said, well, if you had a dream, what would you say that women, you know, in violence really need? And she said, I'd really like to see affordable housing options for women in need. Finally, a couple of Debbie quotes. She told me, I really like helping people like me, people with a disability. When I asked her why, she said, because we're the kind of people who get put on the back burner. Debbie, come on up.
My name is Debbie Waycott. I am 45 years old. 14 years ago, I was in an abusive relationship with my ex-boyfriend, my first child's father. I suffer mental, emotional, and physical abuse. Sometimes the scar of mental and emotional abuse are more severe than physical. My ex drank a lot, gambled, and smoked dope. He would throw stuff at me, call me bad names, and scream at me. Sometimes he would grab me by the arm or wrist and slam me against the wall. I had to take my son when he was an infant with my ex when he went to the VLT machines to play them. If I didn't take my son, he would beat me when he got home. When my son was 9 months old, I was scared but tired of the abuse. I called my home support worker. She came to get me and my son and took us to Hesty House, the local women's shelter. I stayed at Hesty House for a week. Then me and my ex started to talk at the mall. He said he was sorry and he changed. So I decided to give him a second chance and went back home. Everything went good for 2 months, but then the abuse started all over again. It felt like I was on a roller coaster and couldn't get off. The police were called from my neighbors. When the police arrived, they told me and my son had to leave this domestic situation. I called a family member and she came to get me. The police stayed with me while I packed some of my son's and my stuff. I wanted to have a better life for me and my son. My ex wasn't allowed around us. People called CPS, Child Protection Services, and told them my situation. 2 months later, I went back to my apartment. My ex was gone and not allowed back, ordered by co-op housing. CPS contacted me about my situation and told me I put my son in child endangerment with the abuse I went through. My son went into foster care system. I was allowed to visit and had contacts with him. Then I had a mental and stress breakdown. I took stress seizures and felt worthless. I didn't love myself. I felt like the whole world was against me. I started cutting myself and turned to drugs and prostitution. A support worker from mental health helped me get off the streets and into Ridgewood Addiction Center. 2 months later, I was cleaned up and had my own place. I took self-esteem and life skills courses such as Breaking Free and Power Up. Since then, I have taken courses at Family Plus, parenting courses through the Family Resource Center, and have New Brunswick Association for Community Living working with me and my family. I am also on the board of directors for the St. John Association for Community Living. I still don't see my son. He is 14 now. I'm married to my husband, Andrew. I have a 5-year-old little girl and 3 stepsons and a better life. The courses I have mentioned have made me be a better person. I know my rights more as a woman and a woman living with an intellectual disability. I know my voice and feelings matter and are valuable and respected by others. I like to help others in the community who have been in an abusive relationship like I have, and people who have disabilities. I know there are different types of abuse out there, from spousal to elder abuse and so on. These problems have to be addressed and helped in the community to make women feel safer and appreciated, loved, and respected. The government and agencies have to make sure there is funding for services to help victims of abuse and have the right programs in the community to help. 3 things that helped change my life after my abuse situation are: 1 was the course I took, such as Women of Worth at the Community Health Center. It made me realize I was not alone and that other women go through the abuse too. I felt I could talk to someone about it, that I was safe, and these courses boost my self-esteem, confidence, and my self-esteem. The key of well-being built my self-esteem up, taught me to trust others. 3, not just courses, but I also had a female community police officer come talk to me one-on-one. It taught me the legal side of abuse and my rights as a victim of abuse. It also taught me that emotional and mental abuse can be worse than physical. The scars of physical abuse heals. The 3 things I had problems with: Hasty House, the workers were good, but the women that stayed there, they were nosy and wanted to know my business. Well, they were. Legal help, legal aid was for me to talk to and help me until they found out I had a disability. It made me feel like they swept me under the rug. 3, I feel some women do live in an abusive relationship, but it seems the abuser abused more than it is someone with a disability. They think the victim doesn't know the difference and won't say anything. I see a lot of this on public transit in the community. What I would see as supports in the community for women that had through abuse relationships are more safe, affordable housing, more women housing in shelters. Women have to feel safe to go to the shelters and feel safe in our community. 2, more courses in daytime hours, because at nighttime the buses stop early or don't have as many stops. Sometimes women have to walk home by themselves and feel timid and fear what they went through and don't feel safe to go to the course. 3, more one-on-one support, someone who has been a victim of and more what a person went through. I also think having more female community police officers to talk to these women that are victims in the community would be good. Thank you.
Our 4th presentation is with Ken Pike, and I gotta get my breath back here, please. Good, all right, I'm back. And I need my glasses in order to read Ken's bio. I've got to accept the truth. First off, I want to thank Ken because a couple of times just in the last week he has helped me out, and one of them was with a CBC radio interview. My God, I was just so happy to have another voice on there with me, so thanks for being my pal there, and also for helping us find Debbie because she's gold. So a little bit about Ken. Ken is the Director for Social Policy for the New Brunswick Association for Community Living. He's a member of the Law Society of New Brunswick and the Canadian Bar Association, and previously worked in private law practice in St. John. He's worked extensively on policy issues affecting the lives of people with a disability. This has included areas related to employment, housing, social assistance, inclusive education, early learning and childcare, and disability and family supports. He's the author of several publications for families who have a family member with a disability and for professionals. He's the current chairperson of the Community Living Board, Fundy Region, and he's the treasurer for the St. John Association for Community Living. Ken is a passionate advocate for social justice and human rights, and he's the recipient of the 2008 New Brunswick Human Rights Award.
And thanks to the Human Development Council for the opportunity to talk to you tonight. My only regret is having to go after Debbie. And, thank you, Debbie, for telling your story and bringing that perspective to the group tonight. I just want to talk a little bit more generally about violence against women with an intellectual or other disability. I'm going to paint a little bit of a picture of what's going on, some of the causes of that and barriers, but also maybe talk about some possible solutions and add to what Debbie has already offered. Some troubling, I'd say troubling is probably an understatement, but some statistics on violence. There's been a fair bit of research done in this area. What research studies have shown that certainly violence against women with a disability is a serious problem. 2011 report of the Canadian Women's Foundation has noted that women experience different types of violence across their lifespan. The rates of violent victimization, this could include robbery, sexual and physical assault, has been found to be 2 times higher for people who have an activity limitation, and that's some statistical code for disability of some kind than it is for people without limitations. 65% of violent crimes against people with a disability were committed by somebody the victim knew. And people with a disability are between 50 and 100% more likely to have experienced spousal violence than people without a disability. And women with a disability are 2 times as likely to report severe physical violence and 3 times as likely to be forced into sexual activity. These are serious issues. A recent U.S. study has also estimated the rates of sexual assault against women with cognitive or intellectual disabilities is 3 times that of women without disabilities. So there's a huge issue there. So what are some of the causes of the violence? Well, we know and we've talked about, and Debbie mentioned, poverty. Often that leads to lack of control over the person's own life and personal affairs. Just as choosing their caregivers and choosing people that they live with, and the ability to leave abusive situations. So people are dependent financially on people that are abusive. For people with a disability, is also issues around personal dependence. Oftentimes women have a higher level of dependence to have their basic and personal needs met on other people. And as I said, sometimes these women are also dependent on people that are doing the abuse. So, and this might be a dependence based on physical need, need for support to do things in the home or to look after yourself. There's also physical and social isolation. As we know, in years I've spent in this field in supporting people with an intellectual disability, we know that people are more isolated as a result of their disability, and this isolation enhances their vulnerability. And whether that's isolation in their own home or the community, or sometimes it's isolation in segregated settings. And we know that people live in a variety of types of institutional types of settings, residential facilities. So these places and other situations that lead to a lot of less contact with the outside world for people with a disability. Sometimes there's also a lack of knowledge and understanding, particularly for women young adults, females with an intellectual disability, they sometimes don't recognize abusive behavior, or may not even be aware of their basic rights. Even the right to say no to something that feels wrong, that is wrong, and people are just not always in the place where they understand that. There's also issues of devaluation, and we know that women with a disability are at risk of being more devalued within our community and society. This often can lead to low self-esteem and even to feelings that they are responsible for the abuse and violence that they experience. So there's a lot of issues that create situations where violence can occur. Some of the other barriers that exist, we know for a fact that a lot of stuff just doesn't get reported. There's a lack of disclosure, which stems from many factors, which include a lack of knowledge about. It's okay to tell somebody when something happens, to fear of losing financial or other support, and also fear of not being believed. So a lot of times this is just kept within, you know, when we look at statistics, it's statistics of the stuff we know it's going on, and so the question that has to be asked is, so what do we don't know about, and so what's the scope of the issue that it's not being reported on a regular basis. There's also been a lot of difficulty in people accessing the justice system. Even when the story gets told and abuse is reported, sometimes cases get filtered out by police or crown prosecutors because of perceptions of difficulty of successful prosecution, and that's a reality of our court system. Reasonable probability of a conviction is the test that has to be met before charges are laid, and often we're in situations where, particularly if people have difficulty with communication or remembering specific times or events, that the perception is there that evidence won't be very strong. So in even trying to getting over the hurdle of reporting, there's a second hurdle of is anything going to be done about this if I report. Once in a while we do have situations where charges are laid, and our association has lended support to police officers who have some questions about how to proceed around supporting somebody with an intellectual disability in terms of helping them through that process. And it is a daunting one for any individual, but for a woman or a female who's been victimized, having to go through investigations, questioning, and then through a criminal trial process is extremely stressful. Related to that, I think we need better training. There's a lack of training for professionals. I think police, healthcare, and other professionals sometimes lack training in supporting women with a disability who experience violence. And for example, I think we could do a lot better in terms of training with women who have communication barriers or difficulties, and how do we support them through the process. Also, a lack of violence prevention and training and rights education. Certainly women and girls with a disability often denied just basic education or training in things like healthy relationships, sexuality, and abuse prevention. When this is the case, I mean, we're setting them up for bad things to happen if they don't know how to protect themselves and how to stand up for their rights. There are, a number of years ago, it's 10, 12 years ago, there were a number of changes that were introduced into the Criminal Code and Canada Evidence Act, which made it easier for prosecutions to happen in terms of violence against women with a disability, particularly women with a disability. And a number of those accommodations, I think, are used to varying degrees. Some of the main ones include providing a support person. Could be a victim service worker, a friend or family member that can accompany somebody in a trial process, which could inside of the courtroom or behind a screen. But the Crown must establish that the witness will have a difficulty communicating evidence because of the disability to take advantage of this. Video recordings, as long as they happen soon after the event is reported, could be video recordings, are allowable if the person can communicate evidence, but has difficulty doing so because of disability. That person is still subject to cross-examination through in a trial process, but often important if you're able to do a video recording soon after an event. It's fresher in somebody's memory, and so they're better able to remember events. But still, in a trial process, they may be challenged on their memory, particularly under cross-examination. Another change has been, particularly for people with an intellectual disability, they don't have to make an oath. They don't have to understand what an oath is. They can testify on a promise to tell the truth. And so a lot of these accommodations were first brought in to support children, but they were found to also support people that have various types of disabilities through the process. The difficulty with these, though, is that they're basically accommodations that make the process easier for somebody to testify, and there's still some huge hurdles in terms of the kinds of help that people might need to get through the process. So, what are some possible solutions around addressing this? I think we first have to look at prevention as one of the main areas that we need to address. I think we need to invest heavily in provide increased access to violence prevention training for women with a disability. It's in plain language, that's accessible, and what's involved in that. And we need to start that long before girls become women. That younger females need access to this kind of training as well. Also, rights education, self-advocacy training, increase understanding of basic human rights, enhance skills to communicate rights and needs. The right to say no. This isn't right. This is not something I want. It's as basic as that sounds. If we can teach that to young people and adults, if they don't know that already, it's extremely important. And the improving access to supports to develop and maintain strong personal networks gets back to the issue of people with a disability being isolated, and how do we ensure that we can strengthen personal networks of people. One of the things that we've learned over the years is that people tend to be safer when they have others in their life who care for them and watch out for them. I think we need also more comprehensive training for professionals involved in violence intervention. I think this should involve women with disabilities as trainers. They have, as Debbie has very aptly shown us tonight, that they have stories to tell. And I think they could lend a lot to a process of working with professionals and helping them gain better skills in this area. Also more specialized expertise in victim services programs to better support women with a disability who are victims of witnesses. And what does that mean? I think we'll also, in looking at our current court system, we need to look at some of the promising things going on in other countries around making court processes, particularly criminal justice processes, easier for people to navigate and to participate in. And so in some countries, in particular UK, England and Wales, they now have people who are called intermediaries in court processes involving victims with an intellectual disability. And these aren't the support people that we have in our legislation essentially those support people are there to be with somebody. These intermediaries are actually people that will help people through an examination process in a trial, will help to put things in plainer language if the question is asked, or make a suggestion that the question be rephrased. So these people take a much more active role in supporting somebody through a trial process. And so certainly something I think we should be looking at. And also giving, in some countries, New Zealand, Australia, UK, also now judges have more legislative authority to intervene to support witnesses, so they can step in and provide direct support in court processes, where here in this country, I know they do their best often, but in other countries they have more, I guess, more direct involvement, which is established in law. So there's some a quick overview of some of the issues, I guess one of the things that I'm grateful for is the opportunity to bring awareness to this. I'm glad this is a 3-year project, because we're going to probably need all of it and more to make a dent in these issues, and encourage anybody here who has an interest to stand by people and as we said earlier, be the allies that we need to make a difference. So thank you very much.
Thank you to all 4 speakers. It's really interesting to look at different perspectives, and to look at what violence, not what violence means, but to see violence through a different lens according to which of these groups of women that we're talking about. In terms of looking at indigenous women, we have so much history to look at. There has been so much hurt and pain. There has been so much disrespect. We've got a heck of a long ways to go there. But their journey in terms of violence is not the same, I would say, and Patty, you can speak up here, is not the same as your mainstream citizen in New Brunswick. It looks different, and I think that we need some different approaches. I would say the same thing for all of the groups that we're talking about. When we talk about migrant and refugee women, we need to consider where they're coming from, what their experience was before they set foot on our soil. We need to think about things like difficulties with language. How do you get things across? What about different customs? What about fear of deportation? What about human trafficking? What about all of those issues? And then the third group that we're talking about is women with cognitive disabilities or psychiatric disabilities. And again, a lot of this, we need different approaches. And Kim came up with some great solutions, and I love the idea of women who have these disabilities being the mentors to teach us about how we get the information from. I love that. Okay, somebody write that down. It's being recorded anyway. I want to open this up. The last 10 minutes or so I want to save for talking about where we're going from here, but I do want to open the floor up because I know that some people will have some questions or have some comments, and I just want to open that. Now you can stand up and speak. We've got a mic here. You can if you just have a comment to make, that's fine. If you have a question for one of our speakers, feel free, and we will just get that rolling, and we've got probably about 10 minutes to do this.
Okay, so I think one of the things that we've noticed in common, we're talking about women, and I hazard to say that we're talking about men abusing women most of the time. That is the issue I think that we're talking about, and hardly once tonight has anybody talked about that as a root cause. And I think that that is what we need, where we need our conversation to go. That's difficult. Talking about difficult and uncomfortable, that's difficult and uncomfortable too. But when we're talking about causes, prevention, We need to stop talking about what women can do to help themselves, or to educate themselves, or to arm themselves, or to prepare themselves. We need to talk about who we need to talk to. And we need to talk to men. And we need to talk clearly, loudly, angrily, and we need men to be with us as we do that. We need to stand together with men. So I want to thank the men who are here tonight when we're talking about this issue.
Thank everyone this evening for coming, and certainly for the wonderful information that we received. Neat and I talk a lot about our differences in religion. And I have learned so much from Nihat over the years about the Quran and about that we really are all part of a family. I think that God just has one big dysfunctional family, to tell you the truth. The issue that I think that sometimes that we need to talk about is within the framework of the religion is Sharia law. And we need to understand that people come to our country with different values and beliefs, but there are things that are sacrosanct to any population, any citizen. And I think that it's difficult sometimes when we're coming into a new country to understand their values and their beliefs, and especially the children that are transitioning. Because the children are going to be brought up in a more integrated Canadian culture, and sometimes there is a discrepancy between what the parents have been brought up to believe and think and where the children are now going. And so how do we sensitize so that respectful of all, but we allow the process to come together? And I think it's something that we need to address. We need to address it in a respectful way. But we also have to understand that there are issues around this topic in Canada, and I think a lot of it has to do with lack of information and insight and being proactive rather than reactive. So I thank you. I look forward to you being citizens of Canada along with us. And as I say, I wish you all the best. But I think it is something that we do need to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you.
Overwhelming that this going through, it just has to stop. You know what I mean? About just my wife and our local, it's all over. You know, I'm glad that the councillors came tonight to partake. We have city police here. This is where it starts. We need councillors to know about this. We need city police officers to make social change. I've known you for years, dear. I respected you, and I respect you even more. I knew Sue. She was my Access Centre councillor in 1995, and she helped a lot of women back then, and I root for what you're doing, dear. And me, myself, I'm a former Eastern College criminology student. And from a criminology point of view, the justice system and the social system has to change. People need a wake-up call and make this happen. Thank you.
I just think that, if, like me, I was kind of like, wasn't allowed to do a whole lot of stuff, so I wouldn't have probably been even able to allowed to attend a session like this. So for women, I just feel like if you're in that situation, get out before it's too late. Like, you really need to get out. You can make a million reasons why you want to stay there, but it's not worth it. I almost lost my life in 2014, and you can think of a million reasons why to stay, but you gotta get out. You have to get out. So anyways, it's hard for me to talk about that.
Thank you.
Hi, Debbie, this is for you. I didn't talk about men specifically in my presentation because under migrants, also we have same-sex relationship with a lot of migrants. They come under that because that's the only way to get out of their countries. So when we talk about violence, it can come from a man or a woman, so both sides. It depends on which relationship you are.
I realize that, yes. Predominantly we're talking about women.
I do appreciate the folks that are stepping up. I know that that can sometimes be difficult too, to find a voice and stand up in front of a group and say something. Oh, it's not difficult for you.
Indigenous women and girls has to do with missing and murdered Indigenous boys and men also. And because it is predominantly women that are missing and murdered, that's not to take away the focus from the missing and murdered men and boys. It has a lot to do with the sex trade, addiction, poverty, all of those things. And there are kind of like two groups of people. One group that want to include the men and boys in that, and the other who say, you know, it'll be more bang for your buck if it's just about women. So
It is almost two separate things though, like there's violence in society, violence, and it comes in a myriad of forms, right?
well, actually, it's not violence in society. It's violence against Indigenous society.
Yes, society
Violence
within
against
societies, within
migrant
societies.
men and women. So we can't just put that blanket term, society.
No, but tonight we're talking about violence against women,
Right, but I'm talking about Indigenous men and women.
Take a few moments just to talk about, the town hall is the springboard for a project that's going to be happening over the next few years. So I would like to talk about the project a little bit. Don't be afraid when you see the number of slides. I am not going to read them off to you. I have my slides up there as a reminder to me about what I'm talking about. I also know that the human eye can read much quicker than I can speak. So one of the really cool things about this project is that it's happening in Forest City and having answers to all different types of communities across Canada as to how to deal with some of these issues of violence. All right, so it's led by IRIS, okay? So IRIS is the lead group. They're located in Toronto, and I've already said this, but I do have to put the plugs in because every time I say Human Development Council, Randy gives me $5. Okay, so, and I've already said that the Human Development Council has been recognized for doing work nationally, and that's why they've gotten this contract again. And I've already said this, but I'm really, really happy to have the Domestic Violence Community Action Group as my steering committee to help me out as we go along. All right, so why these three groups? You know, and at first when I was introduced to this project, I thought, well, okay, I understand violence against women, but why are we saying, you know, Indigenous women, migrant women, and women with cognitive or psychiatric disabilities? And through research, we know that there's violence against people, okay? And then, but we know that of the violence against people, if we were to divide that into two sexes, violence against women is a huge issue. If we look at violence against women overall, through research, they have found that these three groups have a much higher incidence of violence. So, and because of backgrounds, history, language, all of those things, we need to find different ways of approaching how to deal with this issue, okay? So that's the reason why the three groups. Higher incidence of violence, a lot of the violence, although we've talked about domestic violence, a lot of the violence that these three groups often face is not domestic. Okay, I just want to make that point. It can be, as Ken mentioned, it can be caregivers. It can be employers. Rhonda mentioned employers taking advantage of people. With Indigenous women, do you think that all of those murdered and missing women, that it was their hubbies?
No.
No. Okay? So it's not all domestic. That's another really big point that we need to make here. In that it looks different, so that when these women are going to report something, their story is different, and some of our agencies need to, I'm going to use the word lenses, they've got to put on a different set of lenses and not judge them or make snap judgments without thinking about what's their background, what's their story, what's the history here. And I remember Ken at one point telling me that there was an incident with someone with intellectual disabilities, and in terms of getting information and making a report, they were having difficulty understanding this person, and they thought, whoever that was, I can't remember who it was, but they thought, oh, we have that New Brunswick Association for Community Living, and they actually had the foresight to get a hold of the New Brunswick Association for Community Living and said, please support us, we want to find out the story, but we need your expertise in figuring this out. Okay? I'm not going to go over this again, okay, but we have the three groups. Indigenous women make up 3% of the population. They make up 10% of the homicides with women. Okay. Again, this has been covered really well by our speakers, these 3 points. So when we talk about structural problems, again, it's looking at history. It's looking at what types of assumptions are we making? What false assumptions are we making when we're looking at these groups of women? Okay, and some of it, again, it could be history. It could be that, you know, where does it hurt? In your chest? Yes. Well, there was a language barrier there, right, in Rama's story. So all of this needs to be looked at, again, through a different lens. We need to be careful and make sure that we're getting the right story from these women, and that we're helping them tell their story, and that we are providing the right support to help them move on to the next step. Okay? This is just exactly what I've just been saying. I'm not going to, and I'm not even going to give you time to read that. Next. Okay. So, from September 2015 up to today, what's been happening through IRIS is that they've done all of this research and figuring out, you know, which 3 groups do we really want to spend time with. And they've done a lot of work that's behind the scenes leading up to tonight. And tonight is sort of the launch of saying, guess what, St. John, we're in. And we want people to talk. We want to bring awareness here. And we will also be asking, you know, if you want more information on a comment card, to make sure that you say that so that we can involve you over the next couple of years. I can't read that one here. Okay, that's the problem sometimes. May I? Where's that? Okay. So now that we've done the town hall, it's sort of like a springboard. The next steps is to work with some of the agencies in St. John and in Toronto and in Regina, but in St. John to look at a few different organizations who work with women who have experienced violence. And we really want to, again, work cooperatively with these organizations and sort of really take a look at how do you deal with different types of situations that aren't the norm, okay? And look at a sort of a safety review process. So working collaboratively with them to say, are there some gaps? You know, are there some holes? Are there community organizations that can help you see some of these situations differently? So that's one part of it. Another part of it is that we want to, over the next couple of years, work with Indigenous women, work with refugee migrant women, work with women with intellectual disabilities and psychiatric disabilities, so that we can learn from them, okay? So that we can learn from them how to better deal with this situation, because they're the ones that can tell us also where the gaps are. They're the ones that can say, you know what, if this had happened, my experience would be different today. Okay, so part of it is working with organizations, part of it is working with individual women, and also taking some of those women's solutions and ideas back to the organizations and saying, have you thought of going about things in this manner or in this way? And hopefully changing some of the ways that we help, support, save women that come from these 3 different groups. That's just what I talked about, the safety organizational review process. Working, I'm way ahead of myself, working directly with the women, and
Amazing.
and how does this cause system, and so working with individual women from these groups is going to cause a systematic change? No way. Well, yes, way, because we need their stories first. We need to, and it will also come to a point where we're doing workshops and so on with women, but where they become empowered, they become the decision makers to go out there and say, this is what needs to be changed, this is where we need to go here, and pushing not only to make change here, but pushing to make change provincially, pushing to make change federally. And again, remember there's 4 cities, and there's nothing like a strong group of women, okay? We could have done that. So, other parts is, I've already talked about this. So gaining knowledge, sharing that knowledge and disseminating it. If you'd like to learn more, you do have a comment card, and if you didn't get one on your way in, because we have a lot more people than what we were expecting, but on that, we really want you to fill out the comment card. If you want more information, sign up there, and we will send you more information. Before we wrap up, though, so my call is, please fill out the comment card. It's really important to us. It's one of our first stepping stones in the process. But Rama has arranged for a special dance is being done by men.
Oh, yay.
Who have brought their wives in celebration of tonight's event. I don't know if you want to add to that.
The only thing I want to add that these men, they usually celebrate in huge Mom's Day, and it was last month, a few weeks back, and some of them they didn't because they didn't know how it works here. And today, because we have this event about women's violence, they said because they left behind other women in violence from their relatives and families, it's their way to show their support to the cause.